The seafood restaurant was too expensive for what it offered, but my family sat around the polished table, as if the gold leaf menus justified every cruel thing they had ever done to me. The night air outside smelled of salt and California money, the kind that whispers rather than shouts, but inside it was ice cold from the air conditioning and colder still from the way everyone at the table looked through me. I sat near the end, far enough from the spotlight, but close enough to hear the words that cut sharper than any blade. Tomorrow was my brother Marcus's graduation from Bud S., the legendary program that turned boys into Navy SEALs, the day that would define his place in the family as the new golden child. My mother Janelle was dressed in pearls, her hair set to perfection and her laugh sharp, and rehearsed. She was not laughing at anything in particular, just enough to be noticed by the other well-dressed guests around us, especially the ones in uniform. Her eyes darted across the room, scanning for importance, her smile painted on tight, like a designer mask. Beside her was Chloe, the bride to be, Marcus's perfect match, pale, slender, all bones and judgment, her hand heavy with diamond rested lightly on Marcus's forearm, as if claiming territory, and Marcus, who had once pulled my braids and begged me to help him with his math homework, now sat tall and silent, soaking in the attention from our father, David Hayes, a retired Navy senior chief, whose very presence filled the table like a command. His approval shone on Marcus like a spotlight, while I sat in the shadows where I always belonged. My presence was almost an afterthought, a seat filled out of obligation, not love. I had flown from Washington, D.C. on my own dime, staying in a modest hotel, while the rest of them basked in beach front luxury. I had told myself I came to support Marcus, but deep down I knew it was a lie. I had come to confirm something I had known for years. I no longer belonged. I was the failed daughter, the dropout, the disappointment, the stain on the Hayes family legacy. And they wore that narrative like a badge of honor. The waiter poured wine and the air buzzed with false praise stories of Marcus's achievements, all spoken like lines in a play. Then Chloe turned to me, her voice a melody of honey and razor blades, and said, "Oh, you actually made it, Amani. I am so surprised." Her lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes, and I felt the shift in the room. The cue had been given. The first strike had landed. I stared at my untouched salad, my fork frozen above the scallops, and said, "Why would you be surprised, Chloe?" My mother leaned in, smiling, as if to calm the air, but she was feeding the fire. "Now, Amani, do not be so defensive." Chloe did not mean anything by it. Chloe's eyes sparkled with mock innocence. "I just assumed your little job, whatever it is, probably could not afford the airfare," she said sweetly, "especially with prices being so high right now, especially for people on a budget." I felt my father's gaze heavy with expectation, waiting for me to lose control, waiting for me to confirm everything he believed about me. Marcus smirked into his drink, pleased with the unfolding scene. "My job pays the bills, Chloe," I replied, my voice flat. She laughed, a hollow chiming sound of superiority. "Oh, I am sure it does," she said softly, fixing printers, resetting passwords. "Is that what you do?" She turned to Marcus, batting her lashes. "It is so sweet that she tries, is not it, baby?" It was not just an insult, it was a message. I was beneath them, and they wanted me to know it. Chloe was their mouthpiece, able to say what they could not or would not, but felt all the same. Her hand reached across the table, resting on mine, her skin cold, her smile colder. "I am just glad you are here," she said, "so you can see what real success looks like." The silence after that was worse than the words themselves. It was agreement unspoken. My mother took a sip of her wine like a toast to Chloe's cruelty, and my father cleared his throat in approval. I pressed my thumb into the water glass until it hurt, willing the pressure to drown out the humiliation. Then Janelle took her turn. Her laughter tinkled like fine china. "Now, Chloe, honey, be nice," she said, though her eyes never left mine. They were filled with judgment, not concern. "At least she is trying. That is what matters." She lifted her glass delicately. Although Amani, that suit, I stiffened. I was wearing a tailored charcoal gray suit, clean, precise, and sharp. It was military issue, formal and unremarkable. That was the point, but she continued, "Are you going to a job interview after this, or maybe applying for food stamps? That suit says I give up." My father snorted into his napkin, wishing she could get a secretary job. She continued, her gaze raking over me like a critique. had been rehearsing. You look so plain, so severe. You need to present yourself better. Look at Marcus, look at his beautiful fiancé, look at your father." She swept her hands across the table. "This is success, baby. This is what it looks like." I felt the heat rise up my neck, not from embarrassment but fury, the kind that simmers just beneath the skin. My mother had always measured love in outcomes, in optics, in performance, and I had always been her failure, the one variable she could not control. I did not realize there was a dress code, Mom, I said evenly. She smiled. "There is always a dress code, Amani. It is called respect. Respect for your brother, for our family. You look like someone who has been forgotten. You make us look like bad parents." I straightened my back, my jaw clenched. "You did provide for me," I said quietly. "Then why do you insist on looking like you work in a cubicle?" She snapped. "Why could you not just follow the path we laid out? Why did you have to be so difficult? Why did you throw everything away?" And there it was, not just a jab at my outfit or my job, but the core question, the one that had haunted every family gathering since I left the Navy. Why was I not Marcus? My silence was answer enough. And then my father, David Hayes, cleared his throat. The sound, a declaration of war. "Enough," he said, and everyone froze. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You came to my table on the eve of your brother's greatest accomplishment and bring this jealous, bitter energy," he said, staring directly at me. I did not say anything. I managed to say, "You did not have to." He balked. "You sit there in your cheap suit, sulking, radiating disrespect to me, your mother, your brother." He leaned forward, his voice iron. "I am a man of the Navy. My son is a man of the Navy tomorrow. He earns the trident, most sacred honor in our service. He is what this family represents. He did the work. He did not quit." And then the final blow. "He is not a drop out," he said, his eyes drilling into mine. The word hit harder than any slap. Dropout, the title he had assigned me 12 years ago. "Tomorrow is about honor," he continued, "about legacy, about the Hayes name. And you will not ruin it with your attitude. You had your chance at honor, Amani, a full scholarship to the Naval Academy, and you threw it away because it was too hard. You are lucky we let you sit here at all. You are my blood, but you are not my legacy. He is. You are my failure, so you will sit there, you will stay silent, and you will show respect. Do you understand me?" I heard the word again, drop out, like a bell tolling for my soul. I sat frozen, my face unreadable, but inside I was unraveling. 12 years ago, I was at the Naval Academy, top 5% in my class. I excelled especially in cybernetics and network defense. I discovered a major flaw in the academy system. I reported it not for fame, but for extra credit. Instead of praise, I got a summons. 2 men in dark suits from the Air Force Cyber Command. They offered me something impossible, a full scholarship, fast track to a commission, a future in cyber warfare at the highest level. But it was classified. I had to leave immediately and sign a mountain of non-disclosure agreements. I could not tell anyone, not even my family. I tried. I told my father it was not quitting, but he did not hear me. Only saw betrayal. He called me a liar, weak, a failure, and that was the end of it. I let him believe it. I let them all believe it. For 12 years, I lived in silence while they mocked me. I let them think I was an IT support tech, living in a rundown apartment fixing printers. I never told them I became a captain by age 28, a major by 31, and now I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. The uniform they mocked was not cheap. It was standard issue for officers attending a civilian event. And my job was not resetting passwords. It was national defense cyber warfare on a scale they could never imagine. And he just called me a failure again. Across the table, Marcus leaned forward, his voice fake, gentle. "Hey, Amani," he said, "glad you came, really, but Dad is right. You are kind of killing the vibe." I stared at him, empty inside. This is a big weekend for the family. All my commanders and teammates will be there. I want it to be perfect. I know that. "Marcus, congratulations." I managed to say thanks. He replied, then lowered his voice. "So about tomorrow, I really think you should stand at the back, in the general crowd, not with the family in the front row." I blinked. Sound of clinking glasses fading around me. Chloe nodded encouragingly from beside him. "We just do not want to confuse anyone," she said sweetly. "We do not want people thinking you are part of the presentation." That word again, presentation. My brother just told me I did not belong even at his ceremony. Marcus, I said, my voice shaking. I am your sister, I know, he replied, looking almost sad, but tomorrow I am a Navy SEAL. And you are well, you please do not make this weird. He had just erased me from the family unit, and no one stopped him. My father said, do what your brother says, Amani, no, your place. I stood slowly, my legs stiff with the weight of years. I need the restroom, I said, and walked away, not looking back. As I left the table, my father's voice rose again, booming with pride. Did you hear who is speaking tomorrow? The commander of Naval Special Warfare, himself, Rear Admiral Thorne. Marcus's eyes lit up. The legend. My mother gasped. Oh, David, we must get a picture. Think of what the neighbors will say, my father roared. I am going to shake his hand, Janelle. He needs to see the kind of men this family produces. And I stopped just past a decorative palm near the exit. Rear Admiral Thorne. I knew that name very well, not as a legend, but as my colleague, the man I brief every Tuesday at 0800 hours. The man who calls me Colonel Hayes. My father wanted to show him the Hayes legacy, and I smiled for the first time that night, a cold smile full of sharp edges. Okay, Dad, I whispered into the salty air, let's make sure he sees exactly that. I turned away from the restaurant into the night, my mind clear. For the first time in years I had the answer, and tomorrow so would they. The morning sun was already hot as we drove toward the base, the light bouncing off car roofs in harsh bright flashes as we crept along the long line of vehicles leading to the naval base, Coronado Gate, the birthplace of Naval Special Warfare, as the sign proudly declared. My father, David Hayes, sat straight as a pole behind the wheel of our rented black SUV, his Navy retired baseball cap perched neatly on his head. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, like he was driving into battle, not a graduation ceremony. He looked proud, energized, alive. This was his world, these were his people, his sacred ground. My mother, Janelle, beside him, was fussing with her makeup in the sun visor mirror, occasionally glancing at the lines of uniformed guards up ahead. Chloe sat behind them on her phone, occasionally lifting her head to peer out the window, and I sat beside her silent, my charcoal gray suit pressed and neat, my hair tied back, my hands still. My heart was steady, my face unreadable. I knew what was coming. The base guards were checking every car, ID after ID, name after name, and I waited for my moment. Our SUV rolled forward through the line. The guards were young, fit, their movements sharp, their uniforms crisp. When we reached the gate, the sailor, barely 19, stepped up to the driver's side, booth clipboard in hand, his face calm and bored. Good morning, sir, he began before my father cut him off. Senior Chief David Hayes, United States Navy, retired, he announced proudly, handing over his military ID like it was a VIP pass. This is my family. We are here for the Bud.'s graduation. My son Marcus Hayes is one of today's graduates. The guard nodded and asked for the names and IDs of the other passengers, standard procedure, but my father clearly did not appreciate being treated like everyone else. He huffed and muttered, fine, give him your IDs, everyone. My mother handed hers over with a tight smile. Chloe followed suit, smiling with the bored patience of the elite. The sailor checked them both and nodded. Both names were on the guest list for Marcus Hayes. Then he looked at me. Mom, your ID. I handed him my Maryland driver's license, my heart steady. He looked down and read the name aloud, Amani Hayes, then looked back to the list, his finger tracing down the names once, then again, then a third time. He glanced back up at me, then to my father. Sir, I am sorry, but I do not see an Amani Hayes on the approved guest list for Ensign Marcus Hayes. The SUV fell silent for a full 5 seconds. The only sound was a flag snapping in the ocean breeze behind us. Then came the explosion. What the hell did you just say? My father's voice was low, but deadly. The sailor stood his ground. I am sorry, sir, she is not listed. I cannot allow her access without proper clearance. My mother spun around in her seat, glaring at me, her voice hissing with fury. Amani, what did you do? You see, you always rue. In everything you probably gave him the wrong spelling of your name. You cannot even get that right. Chloe laughed softly beside me. I bet she knew she was not on the list and came just to make a scene. How embarrassing. I did not do anything, I said calmly, but my father was already boiling over. He pounded the steering wheel, his face red, his voice rising. This is humiliating. This is unacceptable. He turned to me, his Finger stabbing the air. Look what you did. You are embarrassing us again. Janelle twisted in her seat, pointing at the back door. Get out, she said coldly. Take a cab back to the hotel. You are not ruining this for Marcus. Chloe was texting, probably warning Marcus about the drama happening at the gate. Car behind us honked impatiently, and the sailor looked more uncomfortable by the second. Sir, we need to keep the line moving, he said, and I knew it was time. I leaned forward and spoke clearly. Dad, it is okay, I will get myself in. He scoffed. How? By crying, by making a scene again. I ignored him. I opened a slim black leather case in my purse and pulled out a second ID, not the driver's license, a different card, my common access card, my CSC. The sailor reached for it without much interest, but as he read it, his entire posture changed. He snapped upright, his eyes wide. He scanned the card, and the reader beeped green. He looked at me, then at the rank, then his voice rang out sharp, formal, and precise. My apologies, Mom. I did not realize. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. Reserved parking is just ahead in the Admiral section. Everyone in the SUV fell into a stunned silence. Janelle's lips parted in confusion. Chloe's phone froze in mid-text, and my father's face went pale. The sailor had saluted me and called me Lieutenant Colonel. My father turned slowly, his eyes hollow. You, he whispered. He called you Lieutenant Colonel. I took the card back from the sailor. Thank you, sailor, I said, then turned to my father. Please drive. We are holding up the line. He drove, but it was silent inside the car, dead silent. He did not speak. He parked far away from the Admiral lot, refusing to accept what had just happened. We walked the rest of the way in silence, his pride making him sweat more than the California sun. The graduation field was massive rows of folding white chairs stretched toward the stage at the front. My father marched to the reserved seating as if nothing had happened, his cap straight, his chest puffed. The sign said reserved for immediate family, and there was a young sailor checking names at the rope. But as soon as he saw my father's cap and the program in his hand, the sailor unclipped the rope and let them in. David, Janelle, Chloe. They all filed into the front row, leaving one seat open at the end. I followed slowly, my shoes clicking on the pavement, the heat rising off the ground as I approached the empty chair. I stepped up to the row, my hand on the chair, about to sit down when Janelle moved. She reached down, picked up her expensive handbag, and set it firmly on the empty seat, then looked up at me, her voice soft and fake, apologetic. Oh, sweetie, I am so sorry. This row is just for immediate family. You know your father. Me, Chloe. That is it. She gestured as if the math proved the point. I stared at her, stunned. I am his sister, I said. She smiled tighter. This is for the people who truly supported him, honey. We just do not have space for extras. Extras. The word burned. Chloe looked up from her phone. We just want the officer families to see a strong, united front. You understand, right? No confusion. It is about presentation again. That word, presentation. I looked at my father. He was staring ahead, refusing to meet my eyes. Chloe's smug smile told me everything I needed to know. This had been planned. Marcus had told me last night to stand in the back, and now his fiancée and my own mother were enforcing it like a tactical mission. They had executed me from the family unit. I nodded once, not giving them the satisfaction of a tear or a protest. I turned and walked past them, past other rows, past the happy families who all looked like they belonged, until I reached the back where the chairs ran out and the pavement began. I stood near a concrete pillar, alone, invisible, right where they wanted me to be. From the back, the ceremony started. The booming voice announced the arrival of but S-Class 295, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Music played a marching anthem, and through a cloud of colored smoke the graduates appeared. They were transformed, no longer boys, now they were warriors, their white uniforms sharp, their movements precise and cold. They moved like one machine polished by 6 brutal months of training. I scanned the faces, and there he was, Marcus, front row of the formation, perfect posture, jaw set, the embodiment of everything my parents loved. He looked proud, hard, invincible. I felt a strange mix of something deep in my chest, pride, maybe pain, maybe both, but his words from last night echoed again. Stand at the back. Do not make this weird. I looked at him, and I saw not a brother, but a mask of a soldier, hiding the man who had erased his own sister. The ceremony was long filled with tradition and speeches, every moment designed to hammer in importance of legacy. The sun beat down the air thick with heat and pride, and then the master of ceremonies returned to the podium and said the words my family had waited for, and now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, a leader, a warrior, a graduate of the Naval Academy with over 30 years of service, Rear Admiral Thorne. I watched from the back as the crowd erupted again. My father stood, his hands clapping wildly, his eyes lit up like a child on Christmas. Janelle was grabbing her phone. Chloe was already posing for a selfie, whispering about Instagram captions. This was the moment. They lived for the status, the access, the admiration, and there he was, Admiral Thorne, tall, powerful, eyes like steel, walking to the podium with a quiet authority that silenced thousands. My father was vibrating with pride, whispering, "Marcus, this is him, this is the one I told you about," and all I could do was stand in the back and watch, knowing what was coming, because I knew that man very well, not from articles or myths, but from classified meetings, war rooms, digital battlefields. He knew me not as a dropout, but as Dr. Hayes, the cyber warfare commander, the officer he depended on for information and survival while my family plotted to hide me from view. And now he stood at the microphone talking about sacrifice, about the hidden warriors, about those who protect without needing applause, and I knew he was speaking about people like me. And still they did not see it. My father nodded along, thinking only of Marcus, thinking only of himself, thinking of the handshake, the photo, the validation, and I waited silently, watching, knowing the storm was only seconds away. Admiral Thorne stood tall behind the podium, his white dress uniform crisp, his posture commanding, and as he spoke the entire field hung on his every word. His voice was deep, calm, and carried with it the weight of decades of service. He did not speak like a politician, he spoke like a man who had buried soldiers, who had seen war, who understood sacrifice. He did not talk about medals or glory. He talked about pain, about loss, about the long silent nights when the world forgot about the warriors keeping it safe. He talked about duty and the quiet work that went unseen by the cameras and the reporters. He spoke of the people who served without applause, those who stood in the shadows so that others could walk in the light. And from my place far at the back of the crowd, I felt those words strike deep into my chest, because I knew exactly who he was speaking about, not because of guesswork fantasy, but because I had been in those classified rooms where that man sat with a grim face and demanded answers from my team and from me. I knew the weight he carried, and I knew the trust he had placed in us. Behind the scenes, I had handed him information that saved entire operations. I had spent nights buried in encrypted communications, breaking apart terror cells before they could act. I had done my job, while the rest of the world called me a dropout, a disgrace, a failure. And now the man who knew the truth was standing just 100 yards away from my family, and they had no idea. They were in awe of him. My father David looked like he was witnessing God himself descend from the heavens, his eyes wide, his back straight, his pride radiating from every pore. He whispered to Marcus, gripping his arm, "Did you hear that, Marcus? Did you hear what he said? This man is the reason we have warriors. He is what the Navy is all about. This is the kind of leader who sees real legacy." And Marcus nodded slowly, his expression tight, trying to stay focused while basking in the praise. But Janelle was less subtle. She was digging through her bag, yanking out her phone. "Chloe, help me take a picture now," she whispered. "I need a shot with him in the background. This is going to look amazing when I show the ladies at the club." She hissed at David, "Fix your collar. You are slouching. Chloe, move closer, smile." And Chloe, ever the loyal sidekick, posed with her lips pouted and her phone lifted at the perfect angle to catch the Admiral's image blurry behind her in the distance. She whispered, "This is so good. My friends will die when they see this." They all viewed him as a symbol, as a celebrity, as something to add sparkle to their social media feeds. But I knew him as a partner, as an ally in war rooms where lives were balanced on every keystroke. And then, just as smoothly as he had begun, Admiral Thorne finished his speech. His voice softened, and he looked at the graduates before him. "You are now the tip of the spear," he said, "the shield of the Republic. You are the men our enemies fear. You are United States Navy SEALs. Congratulations." And the field erupted into applause. It was a roaring wave that shook the air, and the graduates held their formation, perfectly still, their discipline unbroken, but the tension radiated off them like electricity. And then came the main event, the moment everyone had waited for. pinning of the golden tridents, the badge of brotherhood, the seal of entry into the elite group, the admiral stepped down from the stage, joined by other senior officers, and began moving down the line of graduates, pinning the badges, one by one, offering quiet words of honor and respect. My father leaned forward in his seat, shaking with excitement. "It is happening," he whispered. "He is coming, Marcus. This is it. He is going to meet you." And then it happened. The admiral stepped in front of my brother. Marcus reached into the tray, held out the golden trident, and looked Marcus directly in the eyes, his face serious, unreadable, and without pause he pinned the badge over Marcus's chest above his heart, and lifted his hand in a salute. Marcus returned the salute, and the admiral gripped his hand. "Congratulations, ensign," he said, his voice low but clear. My father was beaming. His chest expanded like he might lift off the ground. He looked at Janelle and Chloe as if to say, "I told you this was destiny," but the admiral had already begun to move on. He turned to head toward the next graduate, and in that moment my father lost all sense of protocol. He stood up, stepped forward, and blocked the admiral's path. "Sir," he called out loudly, too loudly. Admiral Thorne paused, his expression neutral, but his steps halted. My father reached out his hand. "Senior Chief David Hayes, United States Navy, retired. Sir, it is an honor, a deep honor. That is my son, Sir Marcus Hayes, the one you just pinned. He is my boy, my legacy." Admiral looked down at the offered hand and took it briefly, his face unreadable. "Congratulations, Senior Chief," he said. "You must be very proud." My father was glowing, absolutely glowing. "Thank you, sir. I am proud. He is Hayes' legacy, Navy, through and through." The admiral gave a small professional nod, and then, as smoothly as ever, he turned away and began walking to the next man. But then he stopped. It was a small thing, a pause, a glance. Like all great officers, he scanned the crowd, taking in the environment. His eyes swept over the front, rose over the polished shoes, the saluting families, the proud mothers and proud fathers, and then he looked further. His gaze continued and landed at the far back, where I stood alone. His eyes squinted slightly, trying to focus in the sun. And then I saw the recognition, the change in his expression. His eyes locked on me and held the air around me, vanished. World fell silent. The admiral turned his body slightly, his brow furrowed, and then softened. His steps changed direction, and in the blink of an eye, he began walking toward me, not toward the graduates, not toward the officers, but toward the back where the nobodies stood. The crowd noticed first. A murmur spread through the guests' heads, turned, whispers rose. My father noticed too, his brow furrowed. "Where is he going?" he muttered. Janelle turned. "What is he doing?" "David, who is he looking at?" And then they all followed his gaze. They all saw that the most powerful man on the field was walking directly past the front rows, past the honored guests, past the family seating, and straight toward the woman they had told to stand in the back. Chloe leaned in. "Who is he going to? Is that the congressman? No, someone else." And then the admiral reached me, his boots stopping just 3 feet in front of mine, his face now fully lit by the sun, his posture tall and sharp. He did not blink. He looked at me and smiled, a real smile, not the tight official grin, but something warmer and stronger. The field fell into total silence. Every eye turned toward us. My father stood frozen. Janelle's lips parted in confusion. Chloe's phone slipped slightly in her hands, and then my father found his voice. "Amani," he shouted across the silent crowd. "What the hell do you think you are doing? Get back. You are interrupting the ceremony. You are disgracing your brother." His words were desperate, shrill, but the admiral did not even turn. He did not flinch. He kept his eyes on me and smiled wider, and then, in front of the entire field, he snapped to attention and saluted me, his hand raised high, his voice ringing out strong. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, I was not expecting to see you here." And everything broke. The title hit the crowd like a bomb. People gasped, heads turned, jaws dropped. I saw my father freeze, his rage draining into shock, his mouth half open, the word colonel hanging in the air. His hands trembled. Janelle blinked rapidly, her brain trying to process what just happened. Chloe whispered colonel, and Marcus, standing stiff in his uniform, looked like he had been punched in the gut. He was pale as snow. The admiral, still saluting, waited, and I raised my hand and returned it, my voice calm. "Admiral Thorne, it is good to see you, sir. I am here for my brother. He is graduating today." The admiral nodded. "Your brother, small world." He turned then The front rose, his expression shifting from warmth to sharp steel. He looked directly at my father. "You must be Senior Chief Hayes," he said. My father stammered, "Yes, sir, yes, Admiral, that is me." "You are this woman's father?" the Admiral asked, gesturing to me. "Yes, sir, she is my daughter." The Admiral's voice dropped, but it carried across the whole field. "Senior Chief, you must be an extraordinarily proud man." My father blinked, thinking he had been seen. Finally, "Yes, sir, I am. My son." "No," the Admiral cut him off. "Not just your son. I am talking about your daughter. Do you know who she is? Do you have any idea what she does?" My father was silent. The Admiral continued, "Your daughter is one of the most brilliant strategic minds I have ever worked with. Last week, your son was training here. Your daughter was commanding a cyber task force, saving lives. She ran Project Chimera for 72 hours straight and stopped an attack that would have killed an entire SEAL team. Her work keeps men like your son alive." The words slammed into my family like waves. Janelle gasped. Chloe stared. Marcus looked like he was about to be sick. My father turned pale as the Admiral went on. "The Secretary of Defense sends his commendation," he said, his voice steady. "I saw the promotion list come across my desk. I see your file for 06 was just approved. That is astounding, Colonel Hayes." And then he stepped closer and smiled. "So let me be the first to say it publicly. Congratulations on your promotion. Have they sent you the Silver Eagle yet?" Colonel Hayes, my father, David Hayes, E8, Senior Chief Petty Officer, stared at me like I was a ghost. He knew what a colonel was. He knew that was someone he would salute, someone he would obey, someone far above him. And that person was the daughter he called a failure, the dropout, the disgrace. And I turned and looked at him, not with anger, not with revenge, but with the calm, unshakable weight of truth. I was Colonel Amani Hayes, and he had just screamed at me in public in front of the entire Navy that I was a disgrace. The silence on that field was louder than any explosion. My father could not speak, his face hollow, his knees buckling as he held onto the chair in front of him. And I stood tall, my head high, the full sun on my uniform, the field silent and still, and waited for what would come next. Admiral Thorne stood between me and the stunned sea of white uniforms and frozen families, and for the first time in 12 long years I felt the world finally see me as I truly was, not as the dropout, not as the IT girl, not as the one who failed to meet expectations, but as Lieutenant Colonel Amani Hayes, full bird colonel, recently promoted and standing in full view of those who once cast me aside. The Admiral's words still echoed across the parade field, loud enough to cut through heat and silence, both as he spoke about Project Chimera, about how I had led a cyber task force for 72 straight hours without rest, about how my team uncovered encrypted threats and chatter that saved an entire SEAL outpost from annihilation. My father, David Hayes, Senior Chief, Petty Officer, retired, a man who prided himself on structure and tradition, on service and sacrifice, now stood collapsed inside himself, gripping the back of a chair as if to steady the world that had just crumbled beneath his feet. The man who had spent over 30 years saluting officers was now forced to realize that he had been screaming at one, accusing one, disrespecting one, and that officer was me, his daughter, his supposed shame, his alleged failure. And now the Admiral had just declared to an entire graduating class and thousands of gathered military families that I was a warfighter in my own right, not with a rifle, but with my mind and with the command of networks and intelligence. While my brother Marcus was learning to shoot, I was breaking code. While he was running beach drills, I was shutting down international weapons deals in digital silence. And it had taken this moment, this impossible confrontation, for the truth to crack through the polished glass wall my family had built around their fantasy of perfection. Chloe sat stunned, her lips slightly parted, phone limp in her hand, her head slowly turning toward Janelle, who looked like she had been told gravity had been cancelled altogether. Chloe whispered softly, barely audible, "Did he say Secretary of Defense?" And Janelle nodded, her mouth dry, her eyes trying to process what that meant in terms of her precious social hierarchy, because the man she was trying to impress was now saluting the woman she had told to stand in the back. And Marcus, oh Marcus, my younger brother, my pride and pain, the one who had begged me to stand in the general crowd so I would not confuse his teammates or his commanders, the one who had smiled while his fiancée insulted me at dinner, the one who had not even tried to defend me when I was disinvited from the family row. was now standing at rigid attention staring at me across the field, his face pale, his eyes wide, because even he knew what he had just done. He had committed an unspoken sin in the world of military protocol. He had embarrassed and excluded a senior officer, one who outranked him by 4 full levels, one who could end a career with a single report. And though I would never do that, Marcus knew what kind of humiliation he had created, and the fear in his face was louder than any words. Admiral Thorne had not turned back to the stage. He was still standing before me, his posture relaxed, but his eyes holding mine with a calm that only came from shared battlefields, even the silent digital kind. And then he took a step closer and dropped his voice just enough to be conversational, but still loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I saw the promotion list last week. He said your 06 came through clean, no resistance. That is record speed, Colonel. You should be proud." I stood taller, something in my spine locking into place. I had carried so much weight for so long, the shame, the silence, the isolation. And now in a few measured words that burden was no longer mine. The Admiral nodded once slowly and clearly, then said a sentence that sent one last seismic ripple through the front row. "Let me be the first to say it publicly. Congratulations on your promotion, Colonel Hayes. Have they sent you the Silver Eagle yet?" And there it was, the final confirmation. Not only was I a lieutenant colonel, but I had just been promoted to full colonel 06, a rank that my father, who had served nearly his entire life, would never reach, and now the whole parade field knew it. My mother Janelle was frozen, her mouth moving, but no sound coming out. The carefully crafted image of her perfect family, now burning to ash in the California sun. She had planned to use this ceremony as a moment of social status, to be seen next Navy brass, to whisper names at country club brunches, and now she had been reduced to a spectator in her own fantasy. Chloe looked confused. "Colonel, is that better than lieutenant?" she asked, blinking rapidly, trying to calculate her mistake. And my father David looked like he had been physically struck, his breath short, his shoulders sagging, his eyes unable to rise from the pavement in front of him. The word colonel had done what nothing else could. It had shattered the illusion and burned the lie. And still Admiral Thorne was not done. He turned away from me finally and faced the front row, locking eyes with my father one last time. "Senior Chief Hayes," he said, his voice sharper now, his face unreadable, "I just wanted to thank you for raising one of the most exceptional officers I have had the pleasure of working with." My father opened his mouth, trying to speak, but the words would not come. Admiral held his gaze 1 second longer, then turned on his heel, his boots clicking sharply on the concrete as he marched cleanly back toward the stage, leaving behind the wreckage of a family legacy that had just been flipped upside down. The entire ceremony had paused for all of this, and now it resumed. The brass band picked up again, but the notes wavered unsteady. The graduates remained at attention, but I could see heads twitching slightly, eyes darting toward the back, trying to catch one more glance at me, the sister who had been dismissed, the colonel who had been discovered. And as Admiral Thorne returned to the podium, he offered no explanation, no apology, and needed none. His actions had said it all. When he reached the stairs, he looked back just once toward me, and nodded again, silent but strong. I returned it, and then he climbed the steps, resumed his place, and the ceremony continued. But everything had changed. My father sat down slowly, as if aged a decade in 1 minute, his back no longer straight, his shoulders no longer proud. He looked like a man who had lost something priceless and could not figure out how or when, and Janelle did not even try to fix her posture or raise her chin. Her hands clutched her handbag, the same handbag she had used to block me from sitting with them not 20 minutes ago. Chloe said nothing. She had not looked at me once since the Admiral saluted me, and Marcus remained frozen where he stood, his eyes wide, still blinking, his jaw tense. I could see it in his face. The math was being done, the consequences being tallied, and the regret blooming sharp and fast like a strike of lightning. The rest of the graduates were being called now, each walking forward to receive their pin, each getting a few words from the officers, but none from the Admiral. Because the Admiral had already made his statement. He had already pinned the only seal in that class whose sister was a colonel. The rest of the ceremony blurred slightly, a hum of formality and protocol. My eyes never left my family, not in revenge, not in triumph, but in final understanding. I had always believed that one day they would see me, and now they had not because I had demanded it, not because I had forced it, but because the truth had found its moment, because the truth always does when the final trident was pinned, and the band struck up the closing anthem. The crowd rose in thunderous applause, and I remained still near the back next to the pillar where they told me to stand, where they said I would not be seen, where they hoped I would be forgotten. But the man they worshipped had found me anyway, and in doing so he had given me back something I had not known. I was missing not power, not vengeance, but visibility. I walked slowly toward the front, after the crowd began to thin. My head held high, my steps calm, my presence undeniable. The graduates were hugging their families, the crowd cheering, and the Admiral was leaving through a side gate, flanked by aides and junior officers. I did not need to chase him. We had said what needed to be said, and then I passed the front row where David, Janelle, and Chloe sat silent. They did not meet my gaze, they did not say a word, and I said nothing either. I simply walked past them, not above them, not beyond them, but free of them. I passed Marcus, who was walking alone, his face blank, and I nodded once he opened his mouth to speak. But I kept walking because there was nothing left to say, nothing that would undo what had been said by the man they most respected. And in that moment I was not their daughter or their sister or their disappointment. I was Colonel Amani Hayes, United States Air Force Cyber Command, and I had finally stepped out of the shadow they had buried me under. I walked away from the ceremony grounds feeling like I had just stepped out of a storm that had been raging for over a decade, the sounds of applause and brass music fading behind me as I made my way to the parking lot where the California heat clung to my uniform like a second skin. My boots hit the pavement hard and steady, and every step away from that family row felt like I was peeling off the layers they had forced me to wear. The label of Dropout, the black sheep, the weak sister, had been burned away by the Admiral's salute, and in its place stood the truth, raw and undeniable. I was no longer a secret, no longer a hidden success. I was a colonel, and they had heard it not from me, but from the only voice they truly respected, and I knew that hit deeper than anything I could have ever said myself. As I reached my car, I leaned against the door and stared out at the rows of SUV and rental cars that had brought hundreds of proud families to this place where dreams were pinned to uniforms and futures were declared in silver and gold. My own dream had never been to be seen by them, not really. I had long given up hoping for their praise or their love. What I had wanted was to know that I could walk through the fire and come out stronger, and now that I realized that their silence, their shock, their disbelief was not my burden anymore, it was theirs, and they would carry it longer than they knew. I took off my hat slowly and set it on the hood of my car, letting the sweat cool on my forehead as I watched a few late families still gathering for photos and hugs, the backdrop of banners and Navy flags fluttering behind them. I spotted Marcus in the distance walking with Chloe and his friends, his body language stiff, his jaw set tight like he was trying to hold something back, maybe pride, maybe shame, maybe both. I did not care to know anymore. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a message from Major Green, one of my closest colleagues in Cyber Command. It read, "Saw the stream, Admiral, was a beast, congrats on 06 dinner." Soon I smiled, not because of the message, but because it came from someone who knew me, who had fought beside me on digital front lines, who had pulled 70-hour shifts in rooms with no windows tracking threats that never made the news. These were my people, my real tribe, the ones who never needed to be convinced of my worth. I replied briefly, and then opened my car and sat down, letting the cool air wash over me as the AC kicked in. I checked the mirror, adjusted my hair, and took one last look at myself. Uniform crisp, ribbons perfect, rank pins gleaming, and I felt a calm settle over me, not victory, not triumph, just peace. I started the engine and began the drive back to my hotel, the roads winding through the coastal hills, sunlight flashing through the trees as if even nature was celebrating my freedom. I passed a group of cadets running drills on a side field, and one of them paused long enough to notice my insignia and throw a quick salute. I returned it casually, but with respect, because I had been them once, invisible, tired, uncertain, and I knew that sometimes the smallest acknowledgement could carry someone through another day. I reached the hotel and parked underground, avoiding the crowded lot above, and took the elevator straight to my floor, where the quiet hallways felt like a sanctuary. I unlocked my room, kicked off my boots, and let my uniform jacket fall across the bed. Before heading straight for the shower, the hot water was a balm washing away not just the sweat and dust, but the weight of history. Years of biting my tongue at family dinners, the way Janelle would glance at my father before answering my questions, the way David would sigh every time I mentioned anything remotely technical, as if I had already disappointed him by opening my mouth and not talking about kids or kitchen remodels. Whatever else he thought women should care about, I let it all run down the drain, and when I stepped out, I felt clean in a way that had nothing to do with soap. I put on soft clothes, the kind that had no rank, no expectations, and sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, wondering if I should call anyone, maybe Mom, but what was the point? She would be in damage control mode, scrambling to rewrite the story, to spin what had happened into something she could live with. Maybe she would claim she knew all along. Maybe she would say she always suspected I was doing something important, anything to avoid admitting that she had judged me wrongly, and loudly and publicly. No, I would not call her, not yet. Instead, I opened a different message thread, this one with Jordan, my former roommate from the academy, the only one who knew the full story of why I left the Navy path and switched to Air Force. Cyber years ago, she had been there the night I made the call after that disastrous meeting with Commander Brill. When he told me to focus on something more appropriate for my temperament, she had cried with me, drunk wine with me, helped me burn my rejection letter, and then stood beside me every step of the way as I built myself back up. I sent her a simple line: ceremony was wild, you would have loved it. She replied almost instantly, all caps, tell me everything. And I laughed out loud, real and full and free, and then began typing out a quick version of what happened: Admiral, the salute, the stunned faces, and the moment the word Colonel hit like a thunderclap, she sent me a string of emojis, and then said, I'm so proud of you, I always was even when you doubted, and I felt something loosen in my chest again, a knot I did not realize was still there. I set the phone down, leaned back on the pillows, and closed my eyes, letting the soft hum of the AC fill the room. I did not need anything else, not an apology, not a reunion, not even a thank you. I had been seen, and that was enough for now. Tomorrow I would fly back to base and step into a new role with new responsibilities and new missions, and I would do it with the knowledge that I had survived not just the enemy, but the betrayal of those who should have been my first line of defense. And even though they failed me, I had not failed myself, and that was the most powerful truth of all. I woke up the next morning with a strange stillness in my chest, a silence that was not emptiness but something closer to clarity, the kind of quiet that comes after years of noise and chaos, when your mind finally stops running circles around the same old pain. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the past few days settle on me like a heavy but manageable blanket. The ceremony, the salute, the stunned faces of my family, it all played in my head like scenes from a film I had once watched 1,000 times, but now understood differently. I got up slowly, took a long hot shower, and dressed in my off-duty clothes, which felt almost foreign after wearing my uniform so much lately. I grabbed my keys and headed down to the hotel cafe, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to sit somewhere unfamiliar, surrounded by people who did not know me or what had just happened. I ordered coffee and sat near the window, watching the morning traffic move through the streets of San Diego, the sunlight catching on the tops of cars and casting shadows across the pavement. I thought about what came next, not in the grand sense of destiny or purpose, but the practical details. I had to report back in 3 days to my base in Virginia and begin a new assignment, one that would require everything I had learned over the last 16 years of service and sacrifice, and I knew I was ready because for the first time in my life I was not hiding, not from my family, not from their judgment, and certainly not from myself. I took out my phone and saw that I had several unread messages. A few were from friends who had seen the live stream or heard about the ceremony through the grapevine. One was from an old academy professor who wrote simply, I always knew you would make it. I smiled and saved that one without replying yet. Then I saw a message from my mother. It had come late last night and read, I am sorry, I did not know, please call when you can. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I was unsure, but because I had not expected an apology, not even one so brief. I closed the message and slipped the phone back into my pocket because I was not ready to open that door just yet, not when I had only just found my own peace. I finished my coffee and decided to take a walk down to the marina. The salty air and open sky were exactly what I needed. I walked past rows of boats and yachts, some rocking gently in the water, others tied down tight against the morning breeze. There was something soothing about the way the sea moved, never still, never loud, just constant and alive. I thought about how much time I had spent chasing silence in all the wrong places, thinking that if I could just get away from them, if I could just prove myself loud enough, then maybe they would hear me, but they never did, not really. And now that I had shouted with my actions instead of my words, I realized that their hearing me had never been the point. It was me who needed to listen to myself. And I found a bench near the end of the dock and sat there letting the wind mess up my hair and the sun warm my face, and I thought about Marcus and how he had looked after the ceremony, his expression, a mix of confusion and anger and something else that I could not quite name. Maybe he felt betrayed, maybe he felt exposed, I did not know, and I was not sure I cared anymore. I had spent too many years bending over backward to understand them, to give them the benefit of the doubt, to believe that one day they would see me, and now that they finally had, I realized I no longer needed their vision to define me. I checked the time and realized I needed to get back to the hotel to pack. I had a flight the next day and a layover in Dallas before heading back east. I stood up, took one last look at the water, and walked back slowly, feeling lighter with every step, as if I had left something behind on that bench, something I did not need anymore. When I got to my room, I packed methodically, rolling each piece of clothing the way I had been taught back in training, making sure every item was in its place. When I zipped the bag closed, it felt symbolic, like I was sealing away an entire chapter of my life. I looked around the room one last time, turned off the lights, and headed downstairs to check out the clerk at the front desk, smiled, and asked if I had enjoyed my stay. And I told her yes, it had been perfect, which was not a lie. It had been exactly what I needed. I stepped outside into the sunlight and felt the warmth settle into my skin. I took a deep breath and began walking down the sidewalk toward the rental car office, my footsteps steady and unhurried. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was rushing towards something or running from something. I was simply walking, moving forward, and that was enough. I reached the airport earlier than expected and stood in the security line with my bag slung over one shoulder, watching the people around me, some in suits, some in flip-flops, some tired, some excited, all of them moving through the machinery of travel like it was just another chore for me. This airport had always represented something else. It reminded me of departures, of beginnings and goodbyes, of silent promises I had made to myself every time I left a place behind and stepped onto a plane, not knowing what waited for me on the other end. After I got through security, I found my gate and sat down, staring out the large window at the runway, watching a jet take off and vanish into the clouds. The world felt wide open again, and not in a terrifying way this time, but in a way that made me feel like I had earned the space to breathe. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. Still over an hour until boarding. I scrolled through more messages. This time there was one from my brother Marcus. It was just 2 sentences. "I did not know you were capable of that. You really blindsided all of us." I stared at it, not because it surprised me, but because it felt so much like him, short, sharp, and defensive, a shield of pride hiding something much softer underneath. I did not respond. Instead, I closed the phone and leaned back in my chair, resting my head against the wall and letting the hum of the airport fill my ears. I remembered the way he had looked when the general called my name, when he turned and saw me walking up in my uniform, the shock in his face, the confusion, and then the slow burning of realization that I had never been what he said I was. I never failed out, I never quit. I had made it through something he never even attempted, and that had rewritten the script of our family dynamics in a single moment. I boarded the plane when it was called, found my seat near the window, and settled in. I watched the ground disappear beneath us as we lifted off, and I let the altitude press the silence deeper into my chest. I thought of my father, his arms crossed in the audience, his jaw clenched as if trying to hold back something, maybe anger, maybe shame, maybe regret. I had always chased his approval like a dog with a bone. I thought if I could just accomplish enough, he would finally say the words, but I knew now he never would, because to him I would always be the daughter who left who disobeyed, who stood on her own and made him feel smaller not by what I said, but by what I became. I arrived in Dallas during a thunderstorm. The rain drummed against the windows of the terminal, and lightning flashed across the sky as I made my way to the connecting gate. I grabbed a sandwich from a vendor and sat at a table near a charging station, plugged in my phone, and scrolled through the photos from the ceremony. Each image felt like proof of a truth I had always carried alone, now captured and permanent. The moment the general saluted me, the way my hands trembled when I returned it, the way my mother covered her mouth in disbelief, the still shot of Marcus standing with his fists clenched at his sides and his eyes wide. It was all there, and none of it could be taken back. I had stepped into the light, and whether they liked it or not, they had seen me. I boarded the second plane after a delay due to the storm, and by the time we were in the air again, the clouds had cleared and the stars were visible through the tiny round window beside me. I stared at them for a long time, thinking about my first night under the stars in basic training, how scared I was, how alone I felt, and how determined I became in that moment to never let anyone define me by my failures again. I fell asleep somewhere over Tennessee and woke up as we began our descent into Virginia. The city lights below looked like veins glowing under the skin of the earth. I felt a surge of anticipation, not nervousness, but readiness, the kind that comes when you know you are walking into something hard, but you are not afraid anymore. I exited the plane and made my way to baggage claim, grabbed my duffel, and headed out into the cool night air. A car from the base was waiting to pick me up. The driver, a young private, nodded respectfully when he saw me and helped load my bag into the trunk. The drive to the base was quiet except for the soft sound of the radio playing an old country song I remembered from childhood, something about leaving home and finding yourself in the rear view mirror. I watched the trees blur past and thought about how far I had come, not just in miles, but in meaning. When we arrived, I checked in with the duty officer, got my keys, and walked to the barracks where I would be staying for the next phase of my assignment. The room was small, clean, and smelled faintly of bleach. I set down my bag and sat on the edge of the bed, looking around at the bare walls and the folded sheets and the standard issue desk. It felt like a reset, like the page had turned, and this was the start of the next chapter. I opened my bag, pulled out a framed photo I had brought with me, and set it on the desk. It was the only one I kept of myself in uniform before the ceremony, taken years ago on a dusty training field. My face sunburned, my eyes squinting into the camera, but my posture strong. I looked at that younger version of myself and whispered thank you, because she was the one who never quit. She was the one who kept going even when no one believed in her, not even the people who should have. I lay back on the bed, folded my hands on my stomach, and stared at the ceiling, feeling the quiet settle into my bones. And for the first time in my life, the silence felt earned. It felt deserved. It felt like mine. The following week passed in a blur of early mornings, strict routines, and long silent hours spent in the field. My new assignment placed me in a logistics support role, working alongside a team that handled covert supply chains for special operations units scattered across multiple states. It was not glamorous, but it was critical. Every box, every radio signal, every code word mattered, and I treated each detail with the same precision I had carried with me since day one of training. I reported for duty at 0500, each day ran inventory by 0600, and met with my commanding officer by 0700 sharp. There was a rhythm to it, a discipline that gave my thoughts less room to wander back to my family, back to the faces I had seen in the audience when I stepped onto that stage. I knew they were still trying to make sense of it, trying to rewrite the narrative. They had all believed for years that I had failed, that I had dropped out, that I had simply disappeared from duty. I could feel their disbelief still clinging to every memory. They posted online every backhanded compliment they sent my way. My brother Marcus had been especially quiet since that day, only sending one more message that read, "I guess you were serious about all this," which said more about his own expectations than it did about me. I let his words pass without response, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. My superior, Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, was a sharp, observant man who had clearly read every detail of my file. He never questioned my past or my presence here. He simply gave me clear expectations and let my results speak for themselves. He reminded me of the kind of leader I always wanted to be: direct, honest, and impossible to fool. There was one evening when he pulled me aside as I wrapped up logistics reports and said, "You do clean work, soldier. I trust you know that matters more than any name you came from." I simply nodded and thanked him. But his words stuck with me more than I expected. That was the thing about the military. It did not care who your parents were. It did not care if your brother got a medal or if your mother cried at your graduation. It only cared about whether or not you could carry your weight in the darkest hour during that week. I also crossed paths with a few soldiers who had been at the same training base as me years ago. They recognized me immediately, even if they did not say anything directly. One of them, a corporal named Dan, approached me while we were doing gear inspections and said quietly, "You were the ghost back then, the one who never cracked." I smiled faintly and said, "I am still not cracking." He nodded and walked off without another word, but I knew what he meant. There was a quiet kind of reputation I had left behind, one built not on grand gestures or glory, but on surviving, on staying silent and staying sharp, even when no one was watching. It was near the end of that week when the general who had spoken at my brother's seal ceremony came through our base for an inspection. I was called into the front office to assist with presenting our logistics workflow, and I stood at attention as he entered the room, fully aware that he might recognize me from that day. He paused slightly when our eyes met, but he did not call attention to it. Instead, he simply asked for the reports. I handed them over, answered his questions clearly, and stood quietly as he reviewed the data. Once he was finished, he looked up and said, "This operation is tight. I can see why command assigned you here." Then he turned to Reeves and added, "Keep her in charge of inventory. She runs it like clockwork." It was not a compliment meant for show. It was a fact, and in the world I operated in, facts were rare and priceless. After he left, I returned to my bunk, opened the small notebook I carried, and scribbled those words down, not to boast, but to remind myself that truth always finds Dale. No matter how deep it gets buried. That night, I finally responded to my mother's email, the one she had sent days ago, asking if we could talk. I wrote back simply saying, "I am not ready to talk about the past, but I am open to hearing what you have to say." Her reply came the next morning before sunrise. It was long, full of memories, some honest, some sugar-coated, but the final line stood out most. "I see now how much I misunderstood you. I believed what I was told because I was afraid to ask you directly. I am sorry for not fighting for your story." I read that part 3 times before closing the message, not because I forgave her instantly, but because I needed time to decide if I ever could. After finishing my morning duties, I was called into a meeting room for a classified briefing on a new resupply mission. I would be overseeing. The task was critical, involved multiple transport points, and required total secrecy. I was paired with a junior officer named Collins, who seemed skeptical of my presence until halfway through the briefing, when I corrected a logistics timing error before anyone else caught it. From that point on, his attitude shifted. He followed my lead without hesitation, and by the time we completed the mission 2 days later, he saluted me without needing to be told to do so. It reminded me of how slowly respect is built in this world, not through loud words or flashy speeches, but through consistency, through accuracy, through showing up every single time, no matter what ghosts follow you. I ended that week stronger than I had started, not because I had fought any battles in the field, but because I had fought and won the quiet war of doubt, the one my family had loaded onto my back for years. Their voices still echoed in the corners of my mind. They no longer held the same weight. I was not trying to prove anything to them anymore. I was living what I had earned, and I would keep earning it, one flawless report, one completed mission, one long quiet night at a time. The day started earlier than usual with a sharp knock on my door just before 0400, followed by an order to report to the hangar bay in full gear. No explanations, no time to process, just urgency and precision. I moved quickly, pulling on my uniform and checking each strap, buckle, and pouch. Out of habit, not fear, I had learned to move without question and think while moving. By 0430, I was standing in a line of 6 others, all with the same blank stares and locked jaws, waiting for a classified briefing. None of us knew what was coming, which only meant one thing: something real Something big. Our commanding officer, Major Lawson, entered with two other men in civilian clothing, and without greeting us began the rundown. A remote supply drop had failed, the packages were missing, and aerial scans had picked up unauthorized movement in the vicinity. It was not our job to recover, but to confirm the integrity of the route and to relay status without engaging. Contact rules were strict this time: no weapons fired unless directly threatened, no interference with locals, no breaking formation. It sounded like a routine intel walk, but something in Lawson's voice told me this was no walk. The helicopter was already spinning when we exited the hangar. I counted two more teams boarding near by, which meant this was larger than logistics. This was a containment operation without the word being used during the flight. No one spoke. We had trained too long to waste breath on speculation. Instead, I watched the terrain blur beneath us, mentally rehearsing every protocol, every rule, every possible breach point. We landed in a rocky flat about 20 clicks from the target site and immediately began hiking in a staggered line formation. I was placed second behind Corporal Ellis and ahead of Sergeant Darnell, both reliable, focused men who had served through multiple deployments before dawn. We reached the first checkpoint where the drone had lost contact with the cargo, and that was where things shifted. Instead of signs of theft or looting, we found 3 crates untouched, sealed, and arranged almost too neatly as if someone wanted them found. Lawson examined them without opening and ordered us to sweep the perimeter. It was then that I noticed the marks on the nearby tree line. Not random scratches, but a pattern, something coded. I reached for my field journal, snapped a quick sketch, and made a note. The markings were not native, not accidental. They were left by someone trained, someone who wanted to leave a message. I kept this observation quiet, reporting only that there were non-environmental disturbances, which earned a sharp nod from Lawson, who I could tell already suspected more than he was saying. We moved deeper into the zone, approaching what was once an abandoned comms outpost, decommissioned 5 years ago after a failed recon build. As we neared, I saw movement, low, deliberate, not wildlife. I signaled to Ellis, who relayed it up the line, and we froze within seconds. We had a full perimeter watch, but the motion had stopped. Nothing emerged, no sound followed, and Lawson called it off as a false alarm. I did not buy it, neither did Ellis, who muttered someone is watching us before falling back into line. We made it to the outpost just as the light broke over the ridge. Structure was rusted but intact, and the signal boosters were still operational, which made no sense. Lawson tasked me with checking the internal logs, while the rest did a full sweep inside the control room. The monitors flickered to life, and what I saw made my skin crawl. Someone had activated this place 2 nights ago, ran a shortwave burst on an encrypted military channel, and logged out clean. That was not accidental, that was intentional. Someone knew we would come. I reported it, and Lawson's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, only ordered us to wipe the system and disable the grid. Then we burned the logs using thermal gel, not standard but necessary. We were being baited. Someone wanted a response, but they would not get it, not from us. We completed the mission by 1400, and were back in the air by 1600, flying silent with tension wrapped around us like a second skin. Back at base, I was debriefed alone. Lawson asked me why I had noted the tree line marks, what made me notice them. I told him the truth, because I had seen marks like that before, not in training, not on maps, but in real field journals ones my brother had brought home years ago during his first SEAL rotation. He never explained what they meant, only told me they were warning, silent signs used between teams when comms were cut. Lawson nodded and said I was not the only one to recognize them, then dismissed me with a look. I could not read for the next 2 days. I was put on analysis rotation away from fieldwork and given access to decrypted logs for mapping. I knew this was a test, not punishment. They were seeing how I handled information pressure, ambiguity, and I did not flinch. I built the maps, cross-referenced codes, and submitted a report within 48 hours that included a full breakdown of the known symbols, their frequency in hostile zones, and a cross-match with unclassified SEAL mission archives. When I submitted it, Lawson read every line, then looked at me and said, "This report is better than anything Intel has pushed in weeks. Tell me something. Why did you really come back to active service?" I answered without pause because I never left mentally. They just stopped looking for me. His silence told me everything I needed to know from that point on. I was no longer treated as the shadow in the unit. I was the point reference, the one others watched for cues and timing, and it felt not like recognition but like remembering who I was always meant to be. My mother sent another message that week asking if I had received the last email, saying she hoped I was safe and that the family was finally starting to understand. I did not respond, not yet. Some bridges need time, not just words to rebuild. Instead, I wrote back to Marcus the first message I had sent him since the ceremony. I told him that I saw the outpost where his unit had first tested their silent codes, and that I remembered the notebook he had left behind in my room when he enlisted. I told him I used those same markings to guide my team this week, and that whatever he thought I had missed over the years, I had not. His reply came that night. A single line: "You saw more than I gave you credit for, sis, proud of you." I saved that message, and for the first time since everything started, I felt the weight lift, not all of it, enough to breathe deeper. I knew there was still more ahead, more shadows to step through. But in that moment, I stood steady, knowing that the silence they once mistook for weakness had become my sharpest weapon. After the successful completion of the outpost recovery and intelligence mapping, I expected the next week to offer some form of pause, or at least a more analytical role, but that illusion vanished the moment I was summoned again to Major Lawson's office before sunrise. This time the request was specific: bring your code journal, the one I had started back in 2009 during initial training and had continued updating quietly over the years. It contained all my notes, markings, behavioral flags, and counter symbols, things I had picked up while silently observing drills or missions. Even while sidelined, Lawson took it, scanned the first few pages, then handed it to a visiting officer whose insignia I did not recognize at first, but who introduced himself as Commander Reid, an upper division analyst with access to black operations that usually never crossed into our side of the base. He asked no personal questions, only tactical ones, about how I had identified non-standard symbols in the outpost region, and what secondary signs I had used to confirm origin. I answered clearly, knowing this was another test, but one that had less to do with trust and more with verification. After 20 minutes he closed the book, handed it back, and said, "What you caught out there should not have been missed by satellite or drones. We need you to review some legacy patterns from 2006 and cross-check with new field intelligence over the next 3 days." I was assigned to an underground archive room so deep in the East Wing that it felt like exile, but what I found there was anything but irrelevant. Each folder, each microchip I reviewed contained fragments of missions gone silent, missions scrubbed from records but connected by the same pattern of field symbols, shadow units, and failed exfiltration orders. It became clear that someone or some group had been using the same code system, not just for survival, but for communication outside official channels. My brother's notes echoed in my mind, not because he had been part of it, but because he had suspected it. I remembered night before he shipped out the second time how he had warned me that some orders were not coming from where they claimed to. He had said it carefully, like a man speaking across a wire he did not trust, and now here I was seeing that fear spelled out in archived patterns that matched sites across 3 continents. In a single instance I found a mission labeled Broken Glass, a recon op in 2008 that ended in full wipeout except for one sergeant who was extracted under unusual cover. The surviving debrief mentioned silent symbols carved into wood near the perimeter, the exact same ones I had reported last week. I documented everything, recreated the movement paths, the timing, the signal bursts, and when I brought the report to Commander Reid, he reviewed it in silence before asking me to keep the findings internal. For now, this was not suppression. He said this was containment. We do not know who else is watching from the inside. That line hit differently, and it stayed with me the next morning. Lawson met me privately in the airstrip lounge and offered me a restricted, brief, and unofficial mission. Not in the system yet, not sanctioned yet, but required urgent attention. It involved An unlisted comms drop that had been picked up in the dead zone north of the mountain range, an area off limits since 2010, when a faulty mine collapse buried 2 civilian outposts, and the area was sealed under geological hazard clauses, except now something or someone had been transmitting from there in the same frequency code pattern. I had just decoded Lawson asked if I wanted in. I said yes without hesitation, not because I was chasing recognition, but because I had seen enough to know silence was no longer safe. The team assembled was small, only 5 of us, no insignias, no unit tags, just names and call signs. I was paired with a sniper named Harlan, a demolitions expert called Vic, a tech operative named Shaw, and Lawson himself in the field, not as a leader, but as a shadow presence. We left at night, under heavy fog with no official exit logs, and reached the drop zone by foot. After 6 hours, the terrain was rough, uneven, but familiar to those of us, trained in unconventional ops. As we neared the coordinates, the tech devices picked up not just one signal, but 3 scattered and timed like pulses. One of them matched the old signal logs from broken glass, another was active, and the third was repeating a pattern from my own journal, the same signature I had developed as a personal field. Mark, my blood ran cold. Someone out there was copying my symbol. We fanned out in silence, rifles ready, sensors running. Harlan positioned himself on the ridge while I approached first signal node, and what I found was not equipment, but a message carved into stone using my pattern and my spacing, but twisted with a secondary line underneath that read, "You saw it now, see more." It was not a threat. It was an invitation. I stepped back, slowly relayed the finding to Lawson, and he signaled to regroup. The rest of the mission blurred into a mix of calculation and caution. We disabled. The pulses marked the site for shadow recovery and exfilled before dawn. No contact, no engagement, but everything about it screamed trap. We were back on base within 24 hours and immediately debriefed behind sealed doors. Lawson told me quietly that whoever had left that message knew me not by name, but by pattern, and that meant we had either a mole or a mirror, someone trained in the same frameworks, which narrowed the suspect list to under 20 names. High clearance, all of them. I asked if we were tracking them now. He said not yet. We are watching and waiting. I spent the next week under routine assignment, recalibrating drones and verifying route maps, which felt like punishment, but was really insulation. They were protecting me by burying me, and I let it happen. I kept my focus turned inward, reviewing every step, every mission, every choice I had made to see where I might have leaked. But there was nothing I had said, nothing done, nothing visible to trace, and that meant the leak was elsewhere, perhaps even from my brother's old Yun. The thought rattled me, but I pushed it aside and wrote him another message, coded this time and stored in the draft folder of our shared encrypted account, a habit we had used since 2007, when both of us knew eyes were watching. I wrote only 6 words, "Do you remember broken glass symbols?" and logged out. The reply came 3 days later. A photo, not a sentence, a picture of the same ridge from our last mission, and in the corner a carved version of my earliest field Mark 1. Only Marcus and I had ever seen. It was old, weathered, taken years ago. I realized then that my brother had seen all this long before me, and that perhaps he had gone silent, not because he failed, but because he saw too much. I printed the photo, placed it behind the cover of my code journal, and filed the report with Reed, including all pattern matchings, except for that one symbol. Some truths had to remain unsaid, for now I began sleeping less, not from fear, from urgency. Each day felt like a count, and not to something public, but to something breaking from the inside, and I was not going to be the one caught unready anymore. The rain had returned the next evening, falling in sheets across the base, as if trying to wash away the tension that had quietly built since our return from the dead zone. The skies echoed with the low groan of distant thunder, and though the power never flickered, the air itself felt charged. I spent the first half of that night in the monitoring bay reviewing long-wave transmissions with Shaw, who had quietly started recording unusual bursts coming from a decommissioned satellite relay. Shaw was a quiet man, but sharp, always tapping his pen against the console whenever a pattern repeated more than twice. That night he tapped 8 times and then stopped. His face went still, like he had just realized something too deep to explain. I leaned in and asked what he saw. He did not answer right away. Instead, he rewound the burst and isolated a 30-second clip. It was a pulse, a break, and then a four-tone whistle, the same whistle I had heard during that failed training in 2008, the day I had nearly drowned during that underwater stress drill. When I heard it again now on a secure feed, it was not a coincidence. It was a message from someone who had been watching long before I knew they were there. Shaw stared at me and said, "Lo, you recognize that, do not you?" And I nodded slowly, not because I wanted to, but because denial was now a luxury I could not afford. The message was not just directed at the base, it was pointed at me. We logged the feed under a disguised file name, and I marked it for Commander Reed. No context, no commentary, just the raw sequence and a tag that read legacy code match. Hours later, as dawn broke through the gray clouds, I was summoned to the northeast bunker, where Reed met me outside in a plain field uniform, no insignia, no clipboard, just a worn look on his face. He led me into a soundproof chamber and played the whistle sequence again, followed by another I had not heard before. This one was shorter, but ended with a frequency spike identical to the first. "The twist," he said, "is that this one came from inside the base less than 4 hours ago." I felt my chest tighten. Someone was using the old codes from within, and doing it in a way that mimicked the exact rhythm of my earliest pattern formations. Reid did not accuse, he only observed, then asked what I wanted to do next. I replied clearly, "Let me trace it." He nodded and gave me clearance to access internal logs of signal routing for the last 24 hours. What I found buried deep in the rerouted logs was a blind jump from a non-indexed console terminal located 2 floors below the debriefing wing, an area used only for equipment storage and known to be under low surveillance. I ran a silent trace using a burn path protocol Shaw had once designed, and it led me to a terminal marked as archived inactive since 2011, except here it was reactivated just 2 hours ago. I went down there with a secured signal interceptor, no lights, only the red pulse of emergency strips lining the corridor. When I entered the chamber, the console was still warm, a faint hum in the base that told me someone had been there recently. I scanned for prints, no luck. The terminal had been wiped manually, but they left behind something else. A tiny magnetic drive slid beneath the console base. Not much larger than a coin. I pocketed it without a word and returned to my quarters, where I set up an offline rig using backup hardware to analyze the contents. What I found stunned me. Inside were logs, screenshots, images, and audio clips dating back to 2009, all tagged with code markers that had been used in training exercises but never made public. Each file was labeled with a phrase I had used in my own journal at some point, phrases only I would know. One clip was of my brother at a training facility, sitting alone writing in a notebook. One I recognized the moment I saw it, because it had been mine at one time. The footage could not have come from any standard camera angle. The angle was from inside the wall, like someone had embedded surveillance into the very core of our shared housing area. I stared at that image for a long time, and then realized the timestamp, 2009, mid-October, exactly 3 weeks before he was transferred to a covert unit that later disappeared from formal rosters. I replayed the video again, then closed the device and began writing down everything I could remember from that month, every face, every name, every moment when something felt off. At breakfast, at roll call, at the weapons check, I needed to draw a map of memory and cross it with what I now held in my hand. I met Lawson the next morning, in the gym of all places. He was sparring with an instructor and did not pause when I approached, just said, "Lo, you look like you saw a ghost." I replied, "I found a camera inside my room from 2009 that was not placed by the base." He stopped mid-punch, his breath caught, and he waved the instructor away. We walked outside into the morning haze, and I showed him a still from the video. His reaction was not confusion, it was something deeper, recognition. He stared for a long time, then said, "I thought they had scrubbed all that." Lawson then told me that back in 2008, there was a side program, a surveillance training arm, not part of the Navy SEALs, but run parallel. They called it Shadow Tide. The mission was simple: monitor psychological response and independent code development among candidates. The idea was to predict who would improvise under pressure, who would rebel, who would comply. My brother had been tagged as a high-variance actor, someone whose patterns did not align with predicted compliance, so they pushed him deeper, and then they watched me, his sibling, for similar anomalies. I realized in that moment that all my failures, all my quiet removals from assignments, were not punishments, they were observations. They were watching to see what I would do if pushed, isolated, erased, and I had never broken. I had adapted, and that made me dangerous. Lawson did not speak much after that, just said, "Follow the files, and send me only what you trust." I went back to my room with the weight of that truth burning in my chest, and decided to build a timeline matching every coded file to known movements of base personnel. Using a cross-index of activity schedules and entry logs, I isolated 5 names, all high clearance, all still active, and all with unusual access history to both training rooms and archive terminals. I did not confront them. I simply watched, logged their hours, noted who they met and when, and waited for the pattern to repeat, and it did. On the 4th night, one of them entered the terminal wing under the guise of equipment check and left without signing out. I followed them silently to the outer barracks, where they handed off a sealed envelope to a courier dressed as maintenance. I intercepted that courier 20 minutes later off base under the pretense of a security breach and opened the envelope. Inside were printed copies of signal patterns logs and, yes, pages from my own journal. I did not report him. I waited until I had all 5. I compiled everything and sent it directly to Reed under a dead drop with no identifiers, and 3 days later all 5 were reassigned off base under review, not arrested, not exposed, just removed. And I knew that was the best we could hope for now I received no medals, no recognition, not even a nod from Lawson. But when I walked past Reed in the hall next week, he paused and simply said, "Good work," then kept walking. I stood there, not proud, not relieved, but sharper, knowing the game was still unfolding, and I was no longer just a piece, I was a player. 2 days after the silent reassignment of those 5 officers, I started to feel a shift in the base atmosphere, like something underneath the surface was adjusting itself, maybe correcting, maybe retreating. I could not tell, but the tension in the air had changed, and with it came a different kind of weight, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that settles in when you realize that silence has meaning. I was back in the gym, trying to stretch out the tension from my shoulders, when the door opened, and Commander Reed stepped inside, wearing civilian gear, something he rarely did, unless he was preparing for offsite operations. He did not speak, just gestured for me to follow, and I dropped everything without question. We walked to the edge of the southern perimeter, where a low-security transport was waiting. No markings, no driver visible, just an open rear hatch and a folder resting on seat inside. I climbed in, and Reed joined me. The hatch closed, and the vehicle began moving without any word or destination spoken. He handed me the folder. Inside were photos, pages of transcripts, and at the very top a red slip marked "Deceased." I looked up, and Reed met my eyes and said, "We recovered this from a burn site off-grid. We believe your brother left it behind 2 days before he vanished." I opened the folder fully and began reading. The transcripts were interview logs coded with initials and containing direct references to Project Null, a name I had only seen scribbled once before in an old training draft years ago. The logs detailed psychological manipulation programs built not to enhance but to fracture, to break down the mental resistance of high-performing units and rebuild them under isolated command control. My brother had been targeted as a prime candidate, not because he was weak, but because he had shown signs of unpredictable loyalty, not to the chain of command, but to his own moral compass. And that made him a threat. According to the logs, he had been reconditioned, sent through a sequence of simulations so real they left permanent neurological echoes. Some entries noted severe nightmares, confusion, dissociation, loss of memory, but others showed signs of rejection, like he was fighting back, refusing to absorb the synthetic directives. In one entry, he had written a note I could tell was his own words, not a transcribed one. "I know this is not real. They want me to forget who I am, but I remember the ocean. I remember our pact, and I remember my sister. I will not become their ghost." Reading that broke something in me, and stitched something else back together all at once. He had remembered our promise, the one we made when we were just teenagers, barely old enough to grasp what sacrifice meant. We said no matter what they tried to make us, we would stay ourselves or die trying. I clutched that note and closed the folder. I turned to read and asked, "What do you want from me?" And he said, "I want you to find out if he is still alive, and if he is not, I want you to finish what..." He started. I nodded without asking for further instructions because I already knew what that meant. He handed me a second envelope, smaller, sealed with wax, and told me not to open it unless I reached the outer facility. He called it the spindle. I spent the next 2 days preparing, compiling old contact protocols, memorizing routes through abandoned tunnels, and setting up dead drop check-ins with Shaw, who agreed to monitor the signal tower for any changes in the whistle frequency. If anything spiked, I would know. I left the base at 0500 on the third morning under the cover of routine maintenance convoy and rerouted through an old freight path that led into the hills east of the facility. 2 hours in, I switched to foot navigation and hiked for 8 miles until I reached the edge of the old comms tower, long decommissioned and rusted, but still standing like a sentinel from another era. Inside, I found what I hoped I would not: an open terminal logged in under an alias that matched a code from the log's Ghost 04. I tapped into the drive and found one active ping, a silent pulse bouncing between 2 relays forming a narrow corridor of signal traffic masked beneath meteorological noise. I traced it and found it landed in an area 26 miles southeast in what used to be a medical outpost long abandoned after the floods in 2006. I marked the coordinates and left without staying long enough to trip any alert triggers. By dusk, I had reached the ridge line and could see the faint glow of a single structure still drawing power through a buried line. I approached slowly using a stealth path and entered through a side panel where the metal had corroded enough to bend. I found myself in a hallway lit only by failing emergency lights and the distant hum of a generator. I kept moving floor by floor until I found a room marked Echo 5. Inside were stacks of COTS gear crates and old surveillance monitors, and in the far corner, slumped over a table, was a figure breathing slow and shallow. His back was to me, but I knew that frame, the way his shoulder leaned, the tilt of his head. It was him. I approached slowly, afraid that if I said his name too loud, he would vanish. I said his name once low, and he turned and looked at me with eyes that were sunken but aware, eyes that had not forgotten me. He said my name like it was a breath he had held for years. Then he stood with shaky legs and hugged me like he was clinging to the last thread of what was real. We sat, and he told me everything: that he had never died, that they had extracted him, staged the event, and rebuilt him into a ghost operative meant to carry out silent missions under Project Null, but he had broken from their programming, using the memory of our pact as his anchor, and gone off-grid, surviving through abandoned channels and fake logs. He had been feeding misdirects to the same system that tried to erase him. Now they thought he was buried for good. He told me about others like him, not many, but enough to matter. Some had made it out, some had not, and some were still trapped inside, thinking the simulations were real. He gave me a list of names and coordinates, and said, if you can get this to someone outside who still cares, there might be a chance. I took the drive and gave him the envelope Reed had given me. He opened it, read the short message inside, and then nodded. It said, "You are cleared for extraction under classification 13. He folded the paper and said, "We go tomorrow at first light." I helped him clean up, pack what little he had, and rest. That night I sat awake by the door, watching the dark hallway and thinking about how much had been taken from us and how much we had fought just to hold on to who we were. Not soldiers, not shadows, just 2 siblings who once promised to never forget. I knew the road back would not be easy, but it would be ours, and this time we would walk it together. The next morning started with an eerie silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. I opened my eyes and saw my brother, already awake, sitting near the window where faint beams of sunlight slipped through cracks in the boarded panels. He looked stronger than yesterday, more focused, like purpose had returned to him, and I could tell he had made peace with the decision we were about to carry out. We packed our things quickly and quietly, leaving nothing behind that could hint at our presence. Then we slipped out through the same corroded panel we entered from. Disappearing into the morning mist that had swallowed the hills, we traveled light and fast, taking only the essentials. I kept checking the signal repeater I had hidden inside my boot. and when it blinked once then again, I knew Shaw had picked up the surge. We were being watched, and that meant the clock had started. We reached the extraction ridge by mid-afternoon, the same point Raid had mentioned in the first folder, and waited perched among the jagged rocks that overlooked the valley below. It was then that my brother finally spoke in full sentences. For the first time since I found him, he told me about the final phase of Project Null, about how they had planned to erase entire identities and implant operational shells in their place using layered trauma manipulation, combined with artificial memory frames that responded to external triggers, and how only a few ever managed to resist the process. He said he had cracked the code because he held on to a single real memory, a beach day when we were children long before the uniforms, and commands a moment of laughter with sand between our toes and sunburns on our shoulders. He said that memory was more powerful than anything they could implant because it was not just visual, it was felt, it was truth, and truth anchors us. I listened and nodded, understanding that this was what had kept him human, and that I was the last living witness to it. An hour passed then too, until we heard the low whirring of a drone overhead, followed by the soft crunch of tires against loose gravel. I stood ready, weapon low, not aggressive, but prepared, and out from the brush came three figures, all wearing black tactical gear without insignia. One of them was Shaw, her hair tied back, her expression sharp as ever, and behind her were two other agents I did not recognize. She nodded at me, then at my brother, and said, "Extraction is a go, but the path is not clean. We were followed, the trail was burned, but they sniffed something. Your whistle trick only bought us 36 hours tops. They will come." I looked at my brother, and he stepped forward, saying, "Then we make our move now. No more shadows, no more whispers." Shaw handed him a comms pin and activated the tracking disruption field, and we started moving downhill toward the secondary evac point, a flat stretch of terrain near an old flood basin where the drop ship would land. As we crossed the open area, a sharp crack rang out, followed by a low thud, and Shaw dove to the ground, cursing under her breath. The shot had come from the eastern cliff, and I immediately pulled my brother behind a rusted tractor frame, while the other two agents returned fire. I scanned the ridge and spotted a glint just long enough to tag the shooter's position. I gave a hand signal, and one of the agents tossed a flare grenade. Blinding white and red smoke burst upward, followed by the sound of rapid retreat. We moved again, zigzagging through the brush until we hit the extraction field, which had already been marked with infrared tags. The ship appeared 5 minutes later, low, fast, and nearly silent. It hovered just above the basin door, open rope ladder hanging, and we climbed. My brother last. I turned to see him look back one final time before stepping aboard. The moment his foot cleared the ladder, the ship lifted and banked north, flying low and fast over the treetops. The agent beside me handed me a sealed case, saying this is what he stole from the spindle: encrypted files, video logs, data streams, names, proof of everything. I held it tight, knowing this was not just evidence, it was salvation and justice bundled into one metal box. My brother leaned against the wall, breathing steady but quiet, and I reached for his hand, grounding him back to me. Shaw tapped her earpiece and nodded. We had 5 hours until landing at a classified base buried beneath the northern mountains. She said from there we would be rerouted into Protocol 7, which meant full lockdown analysis, and if cleared, public testimony under whistleblower immunity. My brother simply said, "Let them hear me. I want them to know what they made, and what they could not break." I watched him, and for the first time since that ceremony so many years ago, I no longer saw the brother who was lost. I saw the man who came back stronger, not because he avoided the fire, but because he walked through it and carried his truth out in his hands. When we landed, he was taken in for immediate debrief, and I waited outside the chamber alone until Reed walked in, his face unreadable, until he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You did more than any of us dared to try." I wanted to ask why he never told me everything, why the secrecy, why the pain, but his eyes told me. He had done what he could in a war where no one had clean hands, and all I could do was nod and accept that sometimes silence is the only defense we have. I was given clearance to stay in the facility for 72 hours while my brother underwent evaluation, and during that time I read every page of the file. He had retrieved pages that included names of other soldiers missing presumed dead notes from hidden labs describing experiments that read like horror scripts and messages sent between high command officials planning to bury the entire operation under a new name and budget. I forwarded the files to every secure drop point I had ever used and to a journalist I trusted with my life, and by the end of the third day the world knew Project Null was not a rumor, not a myth, but a sanctioned ghost program that failed to erase one man who chose memory over manipulation. My brother walked free 2 weeks later under full protection, and for the first time in years we sat on an actual beach again, quiet, no words needed, just the sound of the waves, and the truth between us. We had both survived in different ways, and now we would begin again, not as ghosts, not as tools, but as people. I sat quietly as the ride to the naval base grew more and more tense with every passing second, and though no one in the car dared to speak openly, I could feel the waves of discomfort rolling off of my family like steam from a boiling pot. My father sat in the front seat stiff and unreadable, pretending to be fully focused on the road, but the occasional glance at me through the rear view mirror gave away that he was watching for a reaction, any reaction, maybe even hoping I would break the silence and give him a reason to argue again. My mother sat next to him, clutching her purse, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded, her knuckles white against the leather strap, while my brother Jake, the so-called hero of the day, sat beside me with his chest puffed out in pride, but his jaw clenched like he was biting down on a truth he refused to share. It had been days since the last family dinner where I had shown up only to be ignored by everyone at the table, as if I were just a ghost haunting their perfect life. And now here we were on our way to celebrate Jake's big moment, as he officially became a Navy SEAL, while the black sheep of the family, me, was expected to stand in silence and smile politely as if I did not carry scars from the way they had treated me for years. The ceremony was scheduled for noon sharp, and as we arrived at the base, the sun was already blazing overhead, casting long shadows on the rows of uniforms and polished shoes lined up in precise formation. Flags fluttered in the wind, and the sound of boots stomping on concrete echoed like thunder through the open field. Families were gathered in neat clusters, clapping and cheering for their sons and daughters, while I stood apart from mine, letting them move ahead without me. I watched Jake march onto the field, his expression carved in stone as he saluted the officer in charge, who returned it with a nod and a few whispered words. I could not hear. The crowd erupted into applause, and my parents beamed with pride, soaking in every second of the spectacle, but I stood at the edge, my presence like a stain on their perfect family picture, and I could almost hear their thoughts begging me not to cause a scene, not to embarrass them by reminding everyone that I too had once worn that same uniform, but had walked away from it under circumstances they never forgave or understood. The announcer stepped forward, listing the names of those who had completed the grueling training program, and Jake's name was among the first called. His body snapped into attention, his face alight with a pride that burned like wildfire, and as he received his trident pin, the symbol of becoming a SEAL, my mother cried, and my father stood tall, his hands behind his back, nodding like a man who had finally been vindicated. I could not tell if Jake ever looked at me, because I never looked away from him, not once, not when the cheers rose, not when the pin was fastened to his chest, and not even when the general took the mic to deliver his address. The general was a tall, weathered man with eyes that had seen too much war and a voice that commanded instant respect. He spoke of courage and brotherhood and sacrifice, and then he said something that made the crowd go still. He said one of the newest SEALs had a sibling who had once been part of the same program and had faced a choice that most would not understand, a choice to walk away, not out of fear or failure, but for a reason that demanded more bravery than staying could ever have required. He paused and looked directly toward the back where I stood, and in that moment it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Then he said the Navy did not forget those who served, nor did it shame those who left with honor, and the words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, sharp and heavy and impossible to ignore. I saw heads turn toward me. I saw confusion flick on my parents' faces, and I saw Jake lower his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. The general continued, saying that sometimes the path of duty was not straight and clean, sometimes it was crooked and painful, but it still deserved respect because it was forged in the same fire as any other, and then, without calling my name, he saluted me a full proper salute in front of hundreds, and though my body remained still, my heart trembled like a building on the verge of collapse. The crowd was silent for a breath, and then someone began to clap, and then others followed until the field echoed with applause, and I felt like for the first time in years I had not been erased, not been forgotten, not been discarded like a broken piece of machinery. My parents did not know where to look, their eyes darting between me and the general, unsure if they should feel shame or pride, and Jake's jaw was tight again, but this time there was a sheen of tears in his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. After the ceremony ended, people came up to shake Jake's hand and offer congratulations, and some even turned to me, nodding respectfully and saying things like, "Thank you for your service," or "You must be proud too," and I nodded in silence, accepting their words like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The ride home was even quieter than the one coming in, and no one dared to speak until we pulled into the driveway. My father turned off the engine and sat still, his hands on the wheel, and then, without looking at me, he muttered something about dinner being ready. If I wanted to come inside, my mother added that there was enough food for everyone, even me, and I knew then that something had shifted. Not everything, not enough to erase the years of pain, but enough to make room for the beginning of something else. Not forgiveness, maybe not even understanding, but something I could live with, something that might one day become peace. And as I stepped out of the car and looked up at the darkening sky, I let out a breath I had been holding for what felt like a lifetime, and walked slowly toward the house, not as the disgrace they thought I was, but as the soldier I had always been, even if they had never seen it until now. I stood there with my arms stiff at my sides as the roar of applause erupted all around me, but none of it was for me. It was all for my brother, who had just stepped forward to accept his Navy SEAL certificate from the Admiral, while my family beamed with pride in the front row. I stayed at the very back near the doors, watching through a narrow window as if I was not even allowed inside the ceremony hall. My mother had tears in her eyes, my father wore his best suit, and even my sister, who had barely spoken to me in years, leaned over to hug our brother when he came back with the document in his hands. The general called out the achievements of the new batch of SEALs, each line filled with honor and bravery, and my brother's name was mentioned as one of the most promising among them. That was when my heart began to race. I knew what was coming next. I had memorized every moment of the agenda, every word that would be said, and every pause that would land like thunder. And then it came. The general paused, looked over the room, and said, "Before we wrap this ceremony, there is one more name I would like to recognize, a man who stood through rejection, humiliation, and false accusations, a man who never tried to defend himself, but proved his worth through action, not words, and a man who is with us in this room today, someone who inspired even our most elite instructors." He called my name, and silence fell like a heavy curtain. My mother turned around slowly, and her smile froze. My father lowered his hands from clapping and stared at the general, confused. My brother looked stunned, and then the general said, "This man was once accused of dropping out of training, but what most of you do not know is that he was sent on a confidential special ops mission in the middle of his training, which required him to remain silent about his assignment. He was instructed to take the fall, pretend to have failed, and stay in the shadows while completing a classified rescue operation that involved retrieving 2 captured American scientists from behind enemy lines. He did that successfully with no backup and minimal resources, and returned without asking for credit or clearing his name. He waited in silence while the world turned its back on him, and that to me is what true honor looks like. I was still frozen near the door when one of the officers approached me and said, "Sir, the general is calling you." I stepped forward slowly as the crowd turned in their seats. The general walked down the steps to greet me halfway and shook my hand with both of his eyes steady and full of respect. Then he stepped aside and raised my arm like I was a champion in a boxing ring. The crowd erupted again, this time louder. My mother was crying, but not out of pride, out of shame. My father looked like he wanted to disappear. My brother had his head lowered, avoiding my gaze, and the general motioned for me to speak. I said nothing, just gave a small nod and a salute before stepping down. I walked past my family without looking at them until I reached the end of the aisle and stopped just before leaving the hall. I turned around and said, for all those years you asked why I stayed quiet. The truth is, I had already said everything I needed to say when I signed up to serve. I did not owe you my truth. You just chose not to believe it. I stepped out into the sunlight, with the applause still echoing behind me, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had finally reclaimed my name on my terms, and they could never take that away again. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.